The air inside the East Baton Rouge Parish Courthouse was thick with the scent of polished oak and the weight of finality. Darius Cole sat at the defendant's table, his hands cuffed, his eyes fixed on the judge as if staring at the gatekeeper of his own grave. Somewhere deep down, he already knew what the verdict would be and that it would not match the truth. Injustice doesn't arrive like a storm. It seeps in quietly, drop by drop, until the flood swallows you whole. Within hours, a man who had never broken the law would be sentenced to 20 years for a crime he did not commit. And within 24, he would return here, not in chains, but with a gun in his hand. Welcome to True Crime's Altar, where every sin is punished, every betrayal has a cost, and every soul must answer to the truth. Like, comment, and subscribe, because these are the stories the guilty prayed would stay buried. Months earlier, the air had smelled of motor oil and sun-baked asphalt, not polished oak and legal dust. Darius's hands, rough from years of turning wrenches, moved effortlessly under the hood of a customer's car. He'd built a quiet, steady life in Baton Rouge, married to Tiana, his high school sweetheart, and running a small garage his father once owned. Money was tight but honest. He believed in hard work, in the idea that doing right meant life would meet you halfway. That belief is the first thing injustice steals. Long before your freedom, it takes your faith and fairness. The day the police came was like any other until the screech of tires stopped in front of the shop. 2 cruisers, 4 officers. They asked his name, his whereabouts the night before. He told them he'd been home with Tiana, watching late-night TV, eating leftover gumbo. But their eyes had already decided he was lying. Moments later, cold steel was on his wrists. Tiana came running from the office, shouting, demanding answers, but they gave her none. When truth is replaced by the need for closure, the wrong person becomes the right suspect in the eyes of the desperate. At the station, Detective Calvin Rhodes slid a manila folder across the table. Inside were grainy stills from a liquor store camera, blurry, shadowed, but they claimed it was him. Darius studied the image. The man in the picture was taller, broader, but to the detective, those differences were close enough. The store clerk's statement sealed the lie, swearing he saw Darius's face under the mask. Darius's protests only fed their certainty. When power decides guilt before the trial, the courtroom becomes nothing more than a stage for tragedy. By the time they charged him, the news had already painted him as the killer. Local headlines creamed his name alongside the word murder. Neighbors who once waved now avoided eye contact. Tiana stood beside him at every hearing, her eyes fierce but weary, her hands gripping his like she could anchor him to a truth the world refused to see. Every day, he told her they'd see justice. Every night, he felt that belief slipping further away. And in that slow unraveling, something dark began to coil inside him, a quiet, patient rage. Vengeance grows best in the shadows left behind when hope is cut down. The trial began on a Monday, the kind of humid Louisiana morning where the air itself seemed heavy with the weight of unspoken verdicts. The courthouse smelled faintly of furniture polish and old paper, the sounds of shuffling feet echoing off high ceilings. Darius walked into the courtroom in an ill-fitting charcoal suit borrowed from his cousin, the fabric loose at the shoulders, the cuffs brushing awkwardly at his wrists. He moved with the restrained steps of a man already chained by something deeper than steel. Tiana sat in the gallery, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes never leaving his face. She looked like a woman balancing on the thin edge of hope, afraid that even blinking would make it slip away. But hope in the gallery cannot silence ambition at the prosecutor's table. Elias Brooks, the district attorney, stepped forward with the kind of confidence that only comes from knowing the scales are already tipped. His opening statement wasn't a presentation, it was a performance, crafted for the headlines and the voting public. He painted Darius as a cold, desperate man with a violent temper, the kind who would shoot a store clerk over less than $100. He spoke with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a preacher delivering a sermon, his voice rising in just the right places to draw nods from the jurors. Injustice often wears the mask of eloquence. convincing the crowd before the truth even has a chance to speak. The prosecution's witnesses came one by one. The store clerk sat rigid on the stand, eyes darting to Darius only when prompted, repeating his claim that he saw Darius's face under the ski mask during the robbery. Under cross-examination, his story wavered. He admitted the lighting was dim, admitted his glasses weren't on at the time, but the damage had been done. A man from 2 blocks away claimed he saw Darius sprinting down the street after the gunshots, though the defense pointed out that it was raining heavily that night, making visibility nearly impossible. Still, his certainty rang louder than logic. Detective Calvin Rhodes took the stand next, his uniform crisp, his words firm. He laid out overwhelming evidence, from grainy security footage to a single partial fingerprint found on the store's counter. What he didn't mention, what he'd chosen to bury, was the verified statement from Tiana placing Darius at home at the time of the murder. Omission is a cousin to lies. Both serve the same master when truth is no longer welcome. Darius' public defender tried to fight back, but it was a losing battle. His objections lacked force. His cross-examinations trailed off into silence. Overworked, underpaid, and juggling too many cases, he could barely keep up with the flood of half-truths pouring from the witness stand. The jury didn't see his exhaustion. They only saw a defense that looked thin compared to the prosecution's polished certainty. Tiana sat through every moment, her heart pounding in her ears as the walls closed in. She watched the jurors avoid Darius's eyes, watched the prosecutor lean back with the quiet smugness of a man who had already won. Each word, each accusation was another nail hammered into the coffin of her husband's freedom. By the third day, the air in the courtroom felt different, thicker, heavier, as if everyone could smell the verdict before it was spoken. When Elias Brooks closed with the words, "We are here to serve justice for the people of Louisiana," it was like scripture to the 12 strangers in the jury box. They nodded. They believed. To cloak greed for victory in the language of justice is to profane the very thing you claim to protect. When court recessed, Tiana leaned forward in her seat, her lips forming the words, "I'm here," but her voice caught before she could make a sound. Darius looked at her for a long moment before nodding once, slow and deliberate. He didn't need to speak. His eyes told her what his mouth would not, that this fight was over, and the verdict had been written before the first gavel strike. Inside him, something colder than fear took root. And when a man understands that the system will not hear his truth, his mind begins to imagine the noise it would take to make them listen. The jury filed back into the courtroom on the fourth day, their footsteps unnervingly uniform, their faces unreadable. Darius sat at the defense table, his hands folded in front of him, his wrists bare but feeling the phantom weight of handcuffs. The room was silent except for the faint rustle of papers and the muted groan of the wooden benches under the weight of onlookers. Judge Loretta Vaughn entered, her black robe flowing behind her like a shadow, and took her seat with the authority of someone accustomed to ending lives with words rather than bullets. The foreman stood, a folded sheet of paper in his hand. He cleared his throat and read the words that felt heavier than any prison gate, "Guilty of first-degree murder." There was no gasp from the gallery, just the collective exhale of inevitability. Darius's shoulders tensed, but his expression didn't change. Tiana's hand flew to her mouth, her body curling forward as if the words had struck her in the chest. Truth dies quietly in a courtroom. It doesn't scream, it doesn't bleed, it simply disappears beneath the weight of consensus. Judge Vaughn's sentencing was swift. 20 years in Angola State Penitentiary without parole. Her tone was steady, almost casual, as though she were reading from a grocery list. She spoke of justice served and closure for the victim's family, never once acknowledging the man before her had been begging for someone to see him, to hear him. Justice without truth is nothing more than a polished form of vengeance. As the bailiff moved to cuff him, Darius glanced at the prosecution's table. Elias Brooks was gathering his papers, the corner of his mouth curved into the faintest smirk. Detective Rhodes avoided eye contact altogether, busying himself with a pen that didn't need clicking. That was the moment Darius felt something in him shift. It wasn't sudden. It was a slow, sinking certainty that the men who had taken his life away would never pay for it unless he made them. When the scales of justice are welded shut, a man will sometimes try to balance them with his own hands, even if blood is the weight he adds. They led him out of the courtroom through a narrow hallway lined with dull beige walls. The smell of stale air and floor cleaner clung to him as they pushed him into the transport van. Tiana stood at the end of the hall, her tear-streaked face pale under the fluorescent lights. She mouthed something, 3 words, but he couldn't tell if it was "I love you" or "don't do it." He looked at her until the van doors slammed shut, cutting off the light.
If you're enjoying this video, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. Share and like this video. It's free and won't cost anything, but it helps and encourages us to grow and do more. Thank you for your kindness, and back to the video.
The drive to Angola was long, the road bordered by swampland and the occasional stretch of farmland. The closer they got, the more Darius felt the weight of what lay ahead, not just the years, but the injustice of every second. He thought of the courtroom, of the smug faces, of the gavel that had sealed his fate. And beneath it all, in the quiet corners of his mind, a plan began to take shape, not in words, but in images. Doors opening, faces falling, the sound of fear replacing the sound of verdicts. Vengeance had found its voice, and it was whispering in his ear. The gates of Angola State Penitentiary loomed like the jaws of some great beast, rust-colored and jagged against the gray Louisiana sky. The van rolled through with a metallic groan, each gate slamming shut behind them in a ritual that felt less like security and more like sealing a tomb. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of sweat, bleach, and the metallic tang of hopelessness. Darius stepped out in his new uniform, orange, stiff, and stifling, his wrists still encircled by cold steel. The clang of the cuffs coming off was the last sound of freedom he'd hear for a long time. Or so they thought. They walked him through narrow corridors lined with cells, voices calling out from the shadows. Some laughed, some cursed, others simply watched with the hungry eyes of men who had been here too long. The cell they gave him was barely wider than his outstretched arms, its walls stained by years of despair. He sat on the thin mattress, the springs digging into his back, and stared at the small barred window high above. From here, even the sky felt out of reach. That first night, sleep didn't come. Instead, his mind replayed every moment from the arrest to the verdict. The clerk's uncertain eyes, the detective's smug certainty, the prosecutor's rehearsed outrage, the judge's unshakable calm. He thought of Tiana, alone, powerless, her life on pause while his had been stolen entirely. That was the night his anger solidified into something sharper, heavier. Rage is patient. It doesn't rush. It sits in the dark, sharpening its edges until it's ready to be used. The next morning, he kept to himself in the yard, watching, listening. Angola had its own hierarchy, its own rules, and Darius knew survival meant finding the cracks in those rules. It was there, in a quiet corner of the yard, that he met a man named Reggie Tate, mid-40s, serving life, eyes sharp enough to read a man's soul. Reggie had seen injustice before, had seen men broken by it, but he also knew men who had used it as fuel. When Darius told him his story, Reggie just nodded slowly. If you're going to do something about it, you don't do it here. You do it where it started. Over the next hours, they talked. Reggie had connections, people inside and outside. Guards who could be bought, favors that could be traded. It was dangerous, reckless even, but in Darius's mind, the risk no longer mattered. A man who has been stripped of everything no longer fears losing what's left. And that is when he is most dangerous. By nightfall, the outline of a plan was there. Reggie knew a guard who had debts to settle and a habit he couldn't afford. With enough money, the guard could smuggle something in, something that could change the course of Darius's fate in a single day. But Darius also knew he needed a reason to be back in court. The idea of an appeal hearing became the perfect cover. Justice twisted into revenge is still injustice. It just changes its target. When he lay back on the thin mattress that night, Darius didn't stare at the barred window anymore. He closed his eyes and saw the courtroom. He could hear the echo of the gavel, the hum of the ceiling fans, the whisper of papers being shuffled. But in this vision, he wasn't in chains. He was standing tall, and for the first time since his arrest, the people who had taken his life would finally have to look him in the eyes and see fear looking back at them. The call came sooner than Darius expected. 2 days after speaking with Reggie, a prison counselor informed him that his attorney had managed to schedule an appeal hearing to review procedural errors in his trial. The words were a lie, of course. There were no errors the court was interested in correcting. But for Darius, it was the key to walking back into the place where his life had been stolen. He nodded slowly, hiding the storm inside him. Sometimes fate doesn't open a door. It leaves it cracked just enough for you to force your way in. The morning of the transfer, the prison yard was still dark, the air thick with dew. A guard named Mitchell, thick-set, with tired eyes and a jaw that clenched when he was nervous, met Darius at his cell. He didn't speak much, just gave the faintest nod before leading him to a storage area near the laundry. There, behind a stack of folded uniforms, Mitchell slid a plain brown paper bag across the floor with the toe of his boot. Inside, wrapped in a thin rag, was a black pistol. No words, no promises, just the cold weight of possibility resting in Darius's hands for a few seconds before he tucked it deep inside the lining of his prison-issued coat. Bribery and desperation walk hand in hand, and together they can lead even the gatekeepers to open the wrong doors. The ride back to Baton Rouge felt different this time. The same beige van, the same rattling chains at his ankles, but his mind was no longer a cage. He sat in silence, head tilted toward the window, watching the blurred landscape of cypress trees and swampland rush by. Every bump in the road made the hidden weapon shift slightly against his ribs, a reminder of what was coming. He didn't think of right or wrong anymore. He thought only of balance, of repayment. And when vengeance becomes the only goal, morality becomes nothing more than an obstacle to be ignored. They arrived at the courthouse mid-morning. The building loomed ahead, its pale stone catching the sunlight like a false beacon. As they led him through the metal detectors that somehow remained silent thanks to Mitchell's earlier arrangement, Darius's heartbeat slowed rather than quickened. He was in control now, at least in his mind. The courtroom smelled the same as before, polished wood, stale paper, and a faint hint of floor cleaner. The sound of footsteps on the tile seemed louder than usual, each one echoing like a countdown. Tiana was there. She hadn't been told about the hearing until late the night before, and her face lit up when she saw him, hope flickering in her eyes. But that flicker dimmed when she caught the way he looked past her, scanning the room instead of meeting her gaze. Hope cannot survive in a place where rage has already built its throne. Elias Brooks sat at the prosecution's table, the same air of self-importance radiating from him, his suit crisp, his pen clicking rhythmically as he pretended to review documents. Detective Rhodes was in the back, leaning casually against the wall, his badge glinting in the light. Judge Loretta Vaughn entered with her usual poise, her robe sweeping the floor as she took her seat. They didn't know they were looking at a man who no longer cared about living past this day. A man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous kind of enemy. As the bailiff called the court to order, Darius's fingers brushed the inside seam of his coat, feeling the cold, unyielding shape that had been hidden there all morning. He glanced at the clock on the wall. In a few minutes, this room would no longer be a courtroom. It would be something else entirely, a place of chaos, of reckoning. And in his mind, he told himself it was justice. But justice born from blood is just another name for destruction. The sound of the bailiff's voice announcing the hearing barely registered in Darius's mind. Every detail of the room seemed sharper than it had ever been. The slow, hypnotic sweep of the ceiling fans above, the way dust floated lazily and the shafts of sunlight streaming through the high windows, the faint squeak of a juror's shoe against the tile. It was as if the courthouse itself knew something terrible was about to happen and was holding its breath. His gaze moved from face to face, lingering with cold focus on the people who had stood between him and the truth. Elias Brooks sat at the prosecution's table, his papers neatly stacked, pen tapping in a rhythm of arrogance. Detective Rhodes leaned back in his seat near the rear wall, one ankle resting over his knee, his badge glinting beneath the fluorescent lights. Judge Loretta Vaughn adjusted her robe, her face composed, lips set into the faintest line of authority. They looked exactly as they had on the day they condemned him, calm, certain, untouchable. And that was the moment Darius's resolve solidified into action. The voices of reason that had whispered to him during the long nights in his cell were silent now, replaced by the pounding of his own heartbeat. Rage had the floor. His hand slid into the inner seam of his coat, fingertips brushing the cold steel hidden there. The pistol felt heavier than he remembered, as if it knew the gravity of what was about to happen. He rose from his chair slowly, the chains at his ankles clinking just loud enough to draw the eyes of a few in the gallery. Then, without a word, he shoved the defense table aside. The screech of wood against tile was drowned instantly by the crack of the first gunshot. Elias Brooks jerked backward, his chair crashing to the floor, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief as a crimson stain spread across his chest. Gasps and screams broke the still air, but Darius had already swung the barrel toward the back of the room. The second shot echoed like a thunderclap, and Detective Rhodes collapsed sideways against the wall, his badge spinning on the floor. His face, once unreadable, was now frozen in the twisted mask of a man realizing too late that the game he played had taken a turn he could not control. When a man chooses violence, he does not simply change the ending, he destroys the story altogether. Chaos erupted. Benches overturned. Papers flew into the air like startled birds. People dove for the ground or scrambled for the doors. Tiana's voice cut through the pandemonium, shrill and desperate, screaming his name. She was on her feet now, her hands outstretched toward him, but the wall of terror between them was impenetrable. Darius barely heard her. His eyes were scanning, searching for the next face on his list. Judge Vaughn had frozen behind the bench, her gavel still in her hand, as though the authority she carried might protect her. Their eyes met, hers filled with disbelief, his with cold purpose. Another shot split the air. The gavel fell from her hand as she slumped forward, her robe pooling on the floor. The courtroom, once a place of law, had been transformed into an arena of reckoning. Monique Harris, the court clerk, scrambled under her desk, whispering prayers between sobs. Bailiff Henry Dupree, his instincts kicking in, drew his sidearm as he rushed forward. But Darius moved first. The report of the pistol was deafening at close range. The bailiff crashed backward, his weapon sliding harmlessly across the floor. The smell of gunpowder mingled with the acrid scent of fear and adrenaline, thick enough to taste. People cried, pleaded, and begged for their lives. But Darius's vision had narrowed. He no longer saw individuals, only the embodiment of a system that had crushed him. Sirens began to wail outside, distant at first, then swelling until they filled the air like an advancing storm. The pounding of heavy boots on the courthouse steps grew louder, joined by the metallic rattle of weapons being readied. Darius backed into the center of the room, his chest heaving, the pistol still steady in his hand. For the first time that day, hesitation flickered in his eyes. He looked at Tiana. She was pressed against the wall, tears streaking her cheeks, her body trembling. Her lips moved again, and this time he read them clearly. This isn't you. But it was him now, or rather, it was what the years of betrayal, the hours in a cell, and the lies from men in power had made of him. This was the Darius that injustice had created, a man who no longer believed in the possibility of peace. The doors burst open in an explosion of sound and motion. Tactical officers flooded in, their voices a harsh chorus of orders. Drop the weapon. Hands up. On the ground. Darius didn't move. He tightened his grip on the pistol, his gaze sweeping the room one last time. For a brief second, the silence between him and the armed men seemed to stretch endlessly. Then the sharp bark of gunfire shattered it. The force knocked him backward, his weapon spinning from his grasp. He crumpled to the floor, the breath leaving his body in a slow, final sigh. And just like that, it was over. The room was left in the kind of silence that follows disaster, not empty, but full of the weight of what had just happened. He had silenced the people who had taken his life, but he had also silenced himself. No truth had been restored, no justice won. Only more lives destroyed, more hearts broken. When we choose to fight injustice with violence, we do not heal the wound, we only deepen it. We must remember that anger can be righteous, but once it turns to bloodshed, it ceases to be justice and becomes destruction. If you or someone you love faces betrayal, false accusations, or the crushing weight of an unjust system, turn first to the people and resources that can help: advocates, organizations, and authorities who will fight within the light of the law. Seek the truth without losing your soul in the process. Love fiercely, protect one another, and refuse to let the darkness win. This is True Crime's Altar, where every sin is punished, every betrayal has a cost, and every soul must answer to the truth. Tell us in the comments, was there another way for Darius? Could his story have ended without this bloodshed? Subscribe for weekly true crime episodes and let us know where in the world you're watching from.